Hello, I'm Professor Marco Rimanelli. I am a professor for international studies and political science at St. Leo University.
My name is James Campbell. I'm a student of the computer science program and the incoming president of SVA and the secretary of Omega Delta Sigma.
I believe that Pearl Harbor was a turning point where the United States during World War II had remained neutral but pro-Allied and was trying to find ways to convince an isolationist public opinion to get into the war to save Great Britain and later on the Soviet Union from the victorious onslaught of Nazi Germany, and Pearl Harbor with the preemptive attack by Japan on the United States as a way for Japan to create an empire in East Asia and exploit World War II, forced the United States into the war openly, into fighting the Axis. This was also favored by Germany's declaration of war on America as a solidarity with Japan, allowing President Roosevelt to fight first in Europe against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and at the same time in the Pacific against Japan.
I also feel that similar to what we felt after 9/11, this sparked a lot of patriotism and nationalism, which reinvigorated a sense of duty and caused many to enlist into the military or even just serve in other ways at home, whether that was stepping up within their community or finding ways to support those who were serving overseas.
If I may add, unbeknownst at the time, Pearl Harbor, with the sense of nationalism that James was bringing up, split in half the Republican Party, which was the bastion of isolationism. With the war against Japan and also against Nazi Germany, half of the Republicans, it used to be isolationist, became internationalist. And this carried after World War II into the Cold War. Therefore, these internationalists who had been scarred by Pearl Harbor into being activists supported the Democratic President Truman, who replaced President Roosevelt in the Cold War, in allowing him to win the Vandenberg Resolution and the Senate and make America create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as the most successful military alliance in history to contain and stop the Soviet Union in a potential World War III scenario, which had been haunting the Cold War for 45 years and was based, again, on the example of Pearl Harbor, on the example of World War II. Therefore, the policy out of Pearl Harbor becomes also policy against future wars.
I remember you told me earlier that the attack on Pearl Harbor changed the trajectory of the Americans' target. Originally, they wanted Germany to attack them, but so they can fight in the war. But then Japan attacked them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
What historians in the recent decade have been thinking is that indeed World War II was potentially two parallel wars, and Pearl Harbor became the linchpin for either fighting two parallel wars or bringing them together. It was out of the control of the Allies. President Roosevelt wanted to support Great Britain and the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, on the 11th, of December, when both Hitler and Mussolini, for Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, declare war on America because all three, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan, are allied together as the Axis. Therefore, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy voluntarily declared war to bring the entire Axis against America and the West. This allowed Roosevelt to shift the majority of American resources towards the American and British war plans to fight Nazi Germany first offensively in Europe and fight defensively in the Pacific. And therefore we end World War II with indeed the Nazi Germans being defeated by May 1945, and then the Japanese defeated by the end of August 1945 with the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Rimanelli, but the Japanese began their expansion with in China with the Mukden incident, and it beginning in 1937. So I mean, some historians believe that could have been the true begin to World War II.
Oh yes, oh yes. Indeed, we have two regional wars. So yes, these are the trigger points. But when finally the trigger is pushed, and that is Pearl Harbor, it is a Japanese attack on America and on the Allies. It is not an automatic Axis attack. Therefore, then it is Hitler and Mussolini that joined the war and freed the hands of the Allies.
I believe what we had at the time was, after World War I, a lot of the United States was exhausted from war, exhausted, and we were trying to rebuild. People were happy with where the economy was. They didn't want to see that going away. People were comfortable. But what happened with the Pearl Harbor attacks was it brought the United States back to reality, that we were part of a more global system, that we needed to be brought into a more global system of international relations, that we had a responsibility as a global superpower. Normandy Beach has a particular was very meaningful for me. My grandfather actually he served in the D-Day invasion. Right after boot camp, he that was his first duty assignment. They shipped him overseas to Omaha Beach, which was was that the first beach that we visited, Omaha? I believe
Pointe du Hoc, yes.
Yeah, Pointe du Hoc, and right, Pointe du Hoc and Omaha. It was great to be actually able to step on the sand and see how large the beach was, and how difficult it must have been for people to actually storm that beach. But right, it's just incredible how it was just an incredible feat what the Allies were able to pull off on that day. Yeah, my grandfather, he was a signalman first class in the United States Navy. When I was a kid, he didn't really talk about the war much with my family at all. But I was staying over there one year, and he decided that he was going to bring out his war box, and he brought out this Japanese flag. It had it had Japanese writing on it. I later learned that it's actually a house flag that soldiers would carry with them into war. So it was something that really left an impression with me. And so later in life, when I was getting ready to make my decisions of what I was going to do, I decided I was going to follow into his footsteps, and that's what made me decide to enlist into the Navy. As I said earlier, his first assignment, right out of boot camp, they shipped him off over to the Atlantic, to Normandy, France, and D-Day was his first real assignment. The massive invasion on the beaches of Normandy. He was on the decks while everybody was storming the beach. He was signaling aircraft. Of course, they had the enemy aircraft, I'm sure, firing on their vessels. I'm sure it was really intense. He didn't really talk about it much at all. And then a year later, he was sent to the Pacific campaign, over to Marcus Island. He was on on LSM 57, which is a landing ship, which brings vehicles and soldiers onto an island, which I believe it was just a small island in the Pacific, right off of the coast of Japan. But it was considered to be of strategic importance to capture that. Yeah, my grandfather's service was very influential on my life and the decisions I had made to serve. Later, that brought in my naval career to Honolulu, Hawaii. That gave me the opportunity to actually live on Ford Island, which is where the Pearl Harbor attacks happened. From my window, I could see the Utah Memorial, which is the wreckage of the USS Utah. I was telling Dr. Rimonelli just a moment ago of one of the stories of heroism aboard the USS Utah, which is while the vessel was capsizing, Chief Petty Officer Tomic had gone into the boiler rooms, and all of the engineers in the boiler rooms, seeing that ship was capsizing and the sailors aboard many of them were going to meet their doom. The boilers were overloading, and the ship was going to catch fire. So Chief Tomic went in there and he manned the post, and he saved the lives of several of his shipmates, but he lost his own life because of it. So he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was an immigrant before he came to the United States. He got his citizenship by enlisting into the Navy, and it just tells you, because of what was going on in the world, it just shows you what sense of duty that Americans were feeling at the time. It kind of parallels what happened at 9/11. I felt that sense of duty. I know a lot of people I know, when the planes hit the towers, there was that sense of duty that was restored. Whether people felt like they wanted to enlist in the service or become an officer, or just support their country, it didn't matter what political party they were. People were just, they were just united together, and they had that sense of duty. I'm sure it was the same with the Pearl Harbor attacks. People saw something that was going on in the world, and it just brought us together as a country. And there are great stories of heroism that came out of the Pearl Harbor attacks.
I must add to this that we think of Pearl Harbor as a defining moment for America. But you also have to understand that history is chancy. The Japanese made a fundamental mistake in attacking Pearl Harbor. Not the attack per se, that they thought mistakenly would force the Americans into a negotiated peace, but the fact that the rivalry between the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army had not allowed the Japanese government to launch a massive attack on Pearl Harbor at the same time that they were bombing Pearl Harbor. They had not launched a massive attack throughout the Philippines and the entire Southeast Asia with combined naval and army Japanese forces that overwhelmed the Allies. But Pearl Harbor, they did not have a contingent of troops to land. Therefore, the idea was to bomb everything and destroy the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, which they succeeded. Where they failed was they were not able to get the two American carriers at Pearl Harbor, whose sinking would have precipitated a very difficult defense of the Pacific. Okay? And secondly, Admiral Nagumo, in charge of all the Japanese forces in the attack, recalled the planes and left early, thinking that they had achieved the majority of the success. He did not want to chance being in the process of launching the third air attack to blow all of the fuel storage that the Americans had, for fear that the American carriers would show up and attack his carriers disarmed, since the planes were already attacking Pearl Harbor for a third time. So he left. Those petrol storage were able to refuel the American Navy and prepare it for the offensive attack against the Japanese much earlier than had the entire Pearl Harbor been bombed, and the Americans had to rebuild the whole thing. Therefore, we have a dual situation. 6 months later, 8 months later, after the Japanese have conquered all of Southeast Asia, they launched the final invasion of Hawaii. But they meet the Americans at the Battle of Midway just before Hawaii, and by sheer chance the Americans are able to sink all of the Japanese carriers while their planes are on deck being refueled and ready to take off to sink the American carriers. So the Americans had 5 minutes early attack window and were able to sink the Japanese fleet. That allowed the Americans to have few more years to conquer all of the Pacific and roll back the Japanese. Had it been the opposite, had the Japanese been able to attack the American Navy at Midway 5 minutes earlier and do the same, then Pearl Harbor would have been taken with Hawaii by the Japanese invasion fleet in mid-42, and the United States would have been unable to mount any campaign in the Pacific because everything from California would have to be rerouted towards reinvading Hawaii, conquering Hawaii, turning it into the bridgehead to go into East Asia, prolonging the war. So Pearl Harbor as a major attack in December 1941 goes hand in glove with Midway in summer 1942 to turn the tide towards America. Otherwise, things would have been too difficult. We have to understand that Truman and Roosevelt knew that they needed the bomb to destroy Japan and force Japan into a surrender. Nobody at the time understood the long-term effects of nuclear war and of nuclear radiation. The atomic bomb used in Japan was an experimental device that tells you how much things have changed. The decision to drop the bomb was based on several reasons. One, at the end of World War II, nobody cared for civilian life. On every front, they had bombed with napalm, phosphorus, incendiary bombs, cities in Germany and in Japan, killing hundreds of thousands of people at the same time, with the concept that if you destroy the industrial center of the home front, the administrative center, the country will collapse. Instead, everybody fought even harder, knowing that their families were being killed while they were at the front. Secondly, by the time they invented the nuclear bomb, it seemed scientifically that with one bomb they could have the whole effect of a fleet of bombers destroying a city. Third, they were very afraid that the Japanese had embraced the concept of suicide. They were in a warrior mentality out of the samurai, and the concept of suicide was fight to the end because surrender was dishonorable. So, aware of this, the idea was, let's use these nuclear bombs, force the Japanese out of the war, rather than wait 6 more months, have a conventional landing in southern Japan, and risk 1 million casualties. That is what Roosevelt and later on Truman were looking, and they took full responsibility. In war, at times, however terrible war is, you need to kill a certain amount of people earlier to prevent a very protracted war that will kill 10 times the same amount. It was that people at the time were appalled by the impact of a single nuclear bomb. But we had arrived in 44 to the concept that one single bomb can blow an entire city block. The famous blockbuster was a humongous bomb that by 44, 45 would flatten an entire block of houses. Therefore, the next step was a nuclear bomb.
It's difficult to believe how much has changed in the world just in the short amount of time, relatively short amount of time since World War II, since the end of World War II. But the people of Japan believed that their emperor was a god. They truly believed he was a god. This is not an exaggeration. They were taught he was their god. After World War II, within 4 years, he denounced that he was God, their god, and they revised their policies, and they worked with the U.S. It's crazy to think how much they had to change and adapt to the world after World War II, and how much they had to turn around after all of that, and how much the world had to change and adapt after World War II. It's also interesting to think that for the United States, the World War II began and ended with Japan. It's just interesting, at least.
The devastation of conventional war in Europe, and the destruction of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and the devastation of conventional war in the Pacific. Therefore, all of the 3 powers of the Axis were thoroughly defeated, and the population accepted that they were thoroughly defeated and posed a very minimal security threat in the immediate post-war against the occupying Allied forces, allowing the psychological, political, and economic transformation of these 3 enemies of America and the West into new allies of America and the West, although it meant keeping troops there for 50 years. And still we have troops in Germany, in Italy, in Japan as allies, part of multinational forces. The amount of violence that the total war can unleash has to be tied also to the perception that it is a total war, like World War II. The Second Gulf War and the peacekeeping operation, the Second Afghan War and the peacekeeping operation are regional wars, and the peacekeeping operation is act of victory. Therefore, it's difficult to mobilize the public opinion in the West to continue a very bloody peacekeeping operation against insurgents after victory has been declared. This is completely different from the situation after World War II.
Well, while I was on Ford Island, I was fortunate enough to volunteer on the USS Missouri, which is one of the battleships that was part of the Pearl Harbor attacks. I was part of the restoration efforts. While you're in Honolulu, Hawaii, you can actually go onto Ford Island and you can visit all of the memorials, including Battleship Missouri, the Utah, the Arizona, which is actually it's one of the vessels that was sunken. All of the wreckage is still actually in the harbor and available to be visited. And these vessels are regarded as sacred ground and tombs because they've been closed off and sealed. I know the bodies of the sailors are still within the vessels themselves, and they're considered tombs. The Arizona in particular has a memorial that is visited every day by hundreds of tourists and loved ones who come to respect the deceased. And I know many of the Japanese families come to respect the deceased as well. One of the things that I was impressed with that I've heard of, even right after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy honored the kamikaze pilots that attacked these vessels because they saw them as soldiers honoring their own country, even though these were horrendous attacks on our country. These were still soldiers filling duties to their countries, and they were given these burials at sea, which is the honorable way to carry out respects to the deceased. So my advice to students in regard to Pearl Harbor and events like 9/11 is to search within themselves and find that sense of duty, and where they fall into that. They don't need to necessarily go out and enlist into the military or do anything like that, but maybe find how they can serve their community and support their community, whether that's finding a way to support those who serve or just offering support to the loved ones of service members, or even just getting involved at a local level, or just educating yourself. Knowing your history is a good start to making positive changes and influencing the decisions in our country.